The abrupt ending of his deal with Virgin Records, who were then largely withdrawing from the reggae market, Prince Far-I was left temporarily without a record deal, and worse, an entire album's worth of material that he had submitted to them for release had been declined. The master tapes then misplaced and thought lost forever, no other copies existing. It would be nearly 20 years later that a dubbed cassette copy of that album would be located in the drawer of a former staffer of Adrian Sherwood's Hit Run Records and released through Pressure Sounds in the late 1990s as Health and Strength, a proposed late 1970s album for Virgin Records containing strong material from Prince Far-I, such as Frontline Speech, Brother Joe, a swipe at former Far-I producer Joe Gibbs, who had produced his Under Heavy Manners album, and several songs with a further Gregory Isaacs connection. The voice of Gregory heard on Brother Joe would be nearly 20 years later before the public would get to hear that album from Prince Far-I. Meanwhile, Far-I would rebound with a jump to Trojan Records in the UK, who released his Free From Sin album in 1979, saw the Prince maintain standards, if not particularly break any new ground, was not massively successful. In the meantime, while continuing to record for Trojan Records, he would release 2 albums through the Charisma label, particularly their pre-subsidiary. One called Showcase in a Suitcase, now quite scarce and sought after these days, was a various artists album with Far-I himself appearing alongside other artists that he had produced, such as Bim Sherman, Nago Morris, and others. The next would be a new Prince Far-I vocal album released in 1980 as Livity, showing the sort of costumes Prince Far-I would wear on stage in these days, released through Charisma Records. Would feature reggae music moving, brighter, more up-tempo, almost dance-oriented side of Prince Far-I, showing him once again using singers to effectively lighten the sometimes ponderous heaviness of his own voice, and featuring what sounds like the Roots Radix Band in the guise of the Arabs, recorded at Channel 1 Studio with engineering by Maxi. Also in 1980, Prince Far-I would surface again on Trojan Records with a further vocal outing entitled Jamaican Heroes, maybe not quite matching up to the Livity set on Charisma for cover art direction, but more than matching it in terms of musical quality. Trojan Records, 1980. The title track itself, Jamaican Heroes, would find Far-I name-checking some notable Jamaicans through history, such as William Gordon and the great 20th century civil rights leader Marcus Garvey, pictured on the back, right below His Imperial Majesty. Elsewhere, Far-I would revisit some songs of his from the past, including that Deck of Cards lyric that he had adapted from country music. Would it be at least the third version he'd recorded of that song, and would appear here as Deck of Life, again riding the Satamasagana rhythm, while Natty Champion on the He Prayed rhythm would be a update of Big Fight, which had appeared on the Under Heavy Manners LP, telling its tale of the fictional boxing match between Natty Dreadlocks in the one corner and Babylon in the other. See who's going to take the title. Meanwhile, the sound of Jamaican music was shifting, changing to the early dancehall sound. The band that was setting the new tempo was the Roots Radix. Already playing on this album, Prince Farai, very comfortable with their sound. However, there were aspects of the lyrics he was not comfortable with that rankled with him, particularly the emphasis, especially from the new DJs, the up-and-coming dancehall DJs, the emphasis on carnal concerns, on having fun in the here and now. That did not sit well with Prince Farai and his longtime commitment to lyrics of substance, subjects of righteousness, faith, moral and spiritual upliftment. He would come out swinging against the dancehall DJs on musical history, urging them to know their history and saying, "Me no like when you talk upon the rhythm, boy. A pure gimmicks you a talk." Going on to say, "Mind your mouth, little boy." Prince Farai not happy with some of the lyrical directions the music was taking, while adapting quite nicely to the overall sound of it. This album would have some overdubs added in the UK, with David Toop and Steve Beresford adding some synthesizer and flute overdubs, giving it a more experimental sound. Some nice mixing by Crucial Bunny in Jamaica here, and recorded at Channel 1. It would also feature some backing harmony vocals by female punk band The Slits, particularly leader Ari Up and Vivian Goldman. And that album would be further dubbed up and appear as another Prince Farai dub album, dubbed by Adrian Sherwood in the UK, would appear as Cry Tough Dub Encounter Chapter 3, Prince Farai's fourth dub album overall. This is a reissue from the 1990s on Pressure Sounds, only the seventh release from that album, starting off strong with a foundation of Prince Farai related material. This would see Adrian Sherwood's mixing take on perhaps a more experimental, idiosyncratic tone than he had previously to date, with stretched out time signatures, experimental overdubs, Prince Farai's voice itself heavily distorted on Plant Up, and a very experimental, idiosyncratic tone from Adrian Sherwood under the alias of Dub Syndicate, a name that would crop up later, for now just used as a pseudonym by Adrian Sherwood himself. And this would be released in the UK on the Daddy Cool label. Daddy Cool, a record store that also had a few releases on its own label, was run by the legendary and irascible record shop proprietor Keith Stone, reissued later on in the 1990s by Pressure Sounds. Meanwhile, as Adrian Sherwood's interest in experimenting beyond the parameters of reggae, bringing in different musical genres of industrial and post-punk in some sort of musical petri dish with a mix and match roster of players, would reach fruition in the early 80s with the founding of the On You Sound label. And Ari Up from The Slits would be a key early contributor, appearing in an ad hoc group called New Age Steppers, who would appear on the very first release on the new label. New Age Steppers, with their cover of Junior Biles' Fade Away, the very first release from Adrian Sherwood's On You Sound, which would shortly feature Prince Farai himself.
Come off my hand and my feet. Go a scrub, cause me don't like the grub. Go a scrub. Canatina go a Brixton prison. Canatina go a Pentonville. Canatina go a Alcatraz. Canatina go a Sing Sing. Why? I say fi give me little lead, make me smoke up me weed. Give me little rhythm, come me not deal with it. Give me little jump, come me not deal with it. Give me little beat, come make me rock to the drum and the bass.
Would see another Prince Far-I vocal set surface on Trojan Records in the UK, the very appropriately titled Voice of Thunder LP coming out on Trojan that year. This would see the Prince chanting over very deep, dark, heavy and uncompromising rhythm tracks, no consideration given here to any sort of commercial concerns. In many songs, simply chanting directly from his Bible, beginning with the very first song, 10 Commandments, in which he simply reads them off, seeming to pause, linger, and emphasize and repeat the words, "Thou shalt not kill," before starting over again from the top, as he's still got room to spare on the track. The reason for this very somber and serious side of Prince Far-I apparent on the next song, Tribute to Bob Marley. Bob Marley having just passed away, and Prince Far-I pays him a respectful tribute, while also mentioning some other reggae musicians and artists who had passed away, including General Echo and Don Drummond. The next song after that, Hold the Fort, seems to address the question of who will take over now that Bob Marley is gone, who will keep the music on course, keep it on track. And he seems to answer an earlier song he had done, King of Kings, in which he sang, "Who are the king of reggae music?" Bob Marley. As he says, after the king, there must be a prince. Who are the prince of reggae music? Prince Far-I, seeming to consider the question of taking Bob Marley's mantle upon himself to keep the music on track, holding the fort, as it were. Head of the Buccaneer, looking at history, Pirates of the Caribbean, as well as Julius Caesar and figures from the Bible, while Skinhead looks at some of the racial unrest going on in the UK in locations like Liverpool, Manchester, and other places, and telling the skinheads, the racists, to back off. This album, the rhythm tracks, would then be dubbed over by Adrian Sherwood in the UK, appearing as the final volume in the Cry Tough Dub Encounter series, Chapter 4, also appearing on Trojan Records that year. This one also does not appear to have been reissued. No credits for the mixing, but it is Adrian Sherwood on board, using the tracks from the Voice of Thunder LP to explore the further outer reaches of dub, retaining the saxophone of Deadly Headley from the original vocal LP, which had given it something of a jazz element, a jazz flavor on some tracks, while adding the usual synthesizer overdubs in the UK. Another hard-hitting dub set from Adrian Sherwood.
The morning them fresh and blooming, but in the evening they wither up and gone. No way far. They may come in from the rock. One day Dad went for a walk. They never see Dad return. One day. The other son, around 16-year-old. Well, where he living, we have a pub next door. Jukebox playing. Good songs like a lot of rockers. I couldn't explain the singer really, but good music, but play.
Prince Far I's Livity album had contained an unusual, lesser-known song by him entitled Ghetto Living, almost a short story in song form in which the Prince narrates a scene, a character sketch or study of a teenage boy from the ghetto who is in a pub while music plays on the jukebox and reacts against things going on in his environment, in his life, in a violent and unpredictable way. This storytelling aspect of Prince Far I's music would continue to be developed in conjunction with his longtime friend Adrian Sherwood in the UK. Sherwood, by this point, had established the On You Sound label as his outlet for his continued musical experiments, drawing together artists and musicians from reggae, mixing and matching them with similar players from the worlds of punk, post-punk, and industrial music to see what would transpire. To this end, Sherwood would create several distinct aggregations of players, each with their own distinctive identity, yet with the freedom for members to come and go as different projects and demands on their time materialized. One that Far I would take a place in would be called Singers and Players. Far I would join them on their debut album, War of Words, contributing Quante Jubila, finding him musing again on biblical subjects, declaring that King Solomon's mind is my mind, while their follow-up album, Revenge of the Underdog, would feature an eerie cover portrait of him with his eyes closed as if dead, and feature strong material from Prince Far I, Merchant Ship, musing on slavery, Prodigal Son, again retelling that famous story from the Bible, while Charisma would take a swipe at his former record label. Another swipe at a former Prince Far I label would only appear as an On You Sound 10-inch single called Virgin, giving a strong rebuke to Virgin Records and its boss, Richard Branson. The next Singers and Players album, Staggering Heights, all these early 1980s, would feature the unusual Bedward the Flying Preacher, finding Prince Far I telling the story of a real figure from Jamaican history, a street preacher named Bedward who announced to his congregation that through his divine powers he had been granted the ability to fly at a certain appointed time, which went predictably well for him, though Prince Far I takes some liberties with the actual historical record, while Autobiography finds the Prince retelling his own musical history on record.
This is a true story from my Prince Far I. A very true story about a man called Bedward. Bedward was not a man who cussed bad word, but he sure would. Bedward used to conduct a church in Jamaica. In Jamaica they call it mission. Bedward preached to all the members of his organization that he's going to fly next week Sunday. He's going to fly. Virgin, virgin, virgin. You call yourself virgin, but I know a virgin is to be pure and clean.
For the first time in several years, Prince Farai would take 1982 off as far as album releases under his own name, while he continued his collaborations with Adrian Sherwood in the UK, as well as his own productions of other artists back in Jamaica, with the debut album of a new singer, Reggae George, appearing that year. The highly sought-after Mix-Up LP would see release on Trojan Records in 1982, produced by Prince Farai. The break must have suited Farai, as he came back sounding refreshed and rejuvenated the following year with another album for Trojan Records, Musical History, appearing in 1983 on Trojan Records, finds Farai in very religious mode, talking about every time I talk about Jah, tell them about Jah love, at the cross, working for my Savior, very religious mode. A couple of songs even adapt children's gospel songs in his lyrics. More we are together, the happier we will be. He turns that into a general plea for unity and acceptance, and takes another swipe at his former label, Virgin, and their Frontline imprint with Take Heed Frontline, which he adapts part of the lyrics of the old gospel song, Jesus Loves Me, This I Know, in another sharp rebuke to Virgin Records. The Virgin and their treatment of him obviously still rankling him after several years, while What You're Gonna Do on Judgment Day finds him experimenting with the cadence of his delivery in more of a monotone, halting style of delivery, perhaps as he processes the influence of some of the new dancehall DJs, then carrying the swing in Jamaican music, as the expression goes. One song, I Don't Know Why I Love Jah So, almost sounding a bit like the halting Ika Mouse style of delivery. Very solid album from Prince Farai. Unfortunately, as events transpired, it would be the last one to appear in his lifetime.
Let us talk about Jah. Cause let us talk about Jah. Tell what Jah man. Every time I talk about Jah, I feel good, good, good. Every time I talk about Jah, I feel good, good, good. Cause live good in your neighbor's hood. I don't know, you really should.
Prince Farai had known reggae producer and singer Roy Cousins, founder of the Royals vocal group back in Jamaica. Their paths had crossed from time to time in their travels between the island and Great Britain, yet they'd never been especially close until a chance encounter in the UK when Cousins happened upon Farai doubled over in one of his episodes of abdominal agony for which doctors could find no physical reason. Cousins carried Prince Farai to the hospital, looked after him. This would cement a bond of trust between the two, bring them closer together. Later on, back in Jamaica, Farai would approach Cousins to produce an album of his. Unusual for Farai, who, since his breakthrough under Heavy Manners LP some years before, had largely produced himself. In September of 1983, they would begin recording together in Jamaica, completing a number of tracks. Farai feeling energized, like his voice had gotten back to the original sound he had started with. They had just completed a song called Special Request, in which Farai name checks a number of his fellow artists, Gregory Isaacs, bass player Flabba Holt, and saying that reggae music we follow. It's the music music that unites them and brings them together. Far Eye, wanting to carry on, finished the album that day, but Roy Cousins said, no, we'll leave it for today and come back tomorrow when you're rested. Accordingly, they made arrangements to meet up the next morning, which would be September 15th, 1983, at a spot called Idler's Rest in downtown Kingston, where all the musicians and artists would congregate. Then, accordingly, the next morning, Roy Cousins was waiting there for Prince Far Eye alongside another DJ, Just Stitch, when fellow DJ Jim Brown came running up, breathless, with news that someone had shot and killed Prince Far Eye the night before, after him and Roy Cousins had parted. They were shocked, in disbelief. Just Stitch burst into tears with memories of his own near-fatal shooting that had left him with a permanent disfigurement, came back to him. They decided to walk to Prince Far Eye's house, where they encountered a throng of mourners outside and evidence of the grim crime that had happened within the house, visible on the walls, blood-stained handprints. Far Eye had earlier entered into a business agreement with a well-known producer and promoter to put on a dance. Far Eye had paid some money up front and had agreed to pay the balance upon completion of the dance. However, the dance went awry when the other promoter's mother of his child, his girlfriend, got into a fight in the dance, mashed it up. Far Eye took umbrage at this, feeling the dance had been spoiled through no cause of him, through no fault of his own, and refused to pay the balance owing. This would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. According to Roy Cousins, Far Eye had been at his house watering his garden and had observed two men watching him from the streets, but didn't think too much of it, went back into his living room when the two men burst in and ordered Far Eye and his wife face down on the floor. According to Roy Cousins, Far Eye complied, did not offer resistance, but at some point shots rang out. Far Eye's wife seriously wounded first, but the voice of thunder had been silenced. In the years since, Far Eye has continued to live on in the public's memory. Roy Cousins would posthumously release the album they were working on as Umkhonto We Sizwe, aka Spear of the Nation. Begins somewhat eerily and ironically with Survival, in which Far Eye says, you know a rude boy by the way he turns his cap, and going on to call out murderer, murderer. With Jerry Doghead also paying tribute to a friend of Far Eye's who had fallen victim to gun violence. Those themes coming rather uncomfortably ironically, given the nature of the circumstances in which they were recorded, with Far Eye's impending fate. As Roy Cousins himself has said, Prince Far Eye did not deserve to die that way over a handful of dollars. But Prince Far Eye's memory has continued to live on. There are Facebook groups and pages dedicated to him. His close friend in England, Adrian Sherwood, has continued to sample the voice of Prince Far Eye, that voice of thunder, and even some new material has surfaced more recently through Mike Brooks. This has been my look at Prince Far Eye, the one and only voice of thunder. Thanks for watching, everybody.
Survival is the game down in Jamaica, especially when you live in a ghetto. Separation, you just go there, see, tribulation. You know a rude boy. Me say you know a rude boy by the way he turn his cap. Me say you know a rude boy by the way he even walk. Me say you know the rude boy by the way he even talk. Cause when him go a dance, him no drink steps, him a drink and too. A murderer, they said him travel.